I I am very happy to welcome you to another one of our CRS seminar series. Before we get started, I would just like to provide a land acknowledgement. We would like to recognize that York University has a long-standing relationship with a number of Indigenous nations on whose territories we are currently located. Their presence on these territories precedes the establishment of York University. York University would like to acknowledge its presence on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. This area, known as Tkaronto, has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Alan Clarke, who is a professor emeritus at Utah Valley University. Professor Clarke has authored or co-authored 3 books: North American Genocides, Indigenous Nations, Settler Colonialism and International Law, Rendition to Torture, and The Bitter Fruit of American Justice. His current research is on human migration in the era of climate change and pandemics, with an article forthcoming in the Vermont Law Review, which will actually be the topic of today's presentation: Climate Change, Migration and Pandemics, Human Rights in the Anthropocene. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Clarke.
Well, good morning. Give me a minute while I share the screen. There we go. I just wanted to focus on this lake before I start. It's a pretty stunning photograph. You can see it's from the New York Times, and it just pans out on a lake up in the Andes Mountains, indigenous lands. Pretty appropriate given the indigenous acknowledgement. But if you watch this indigenous person by his traditional lake, it's pretty stunning to see just what the effect of climate change has been in that region of the world. And we'll talk a little bit more about Peru later if we have the time, but just getting a sense of the sort of scale of the disaster all over the world. I didn't know how to better do it than this. So in any event, my thesis today is pretty simple. Climate change intersects with pandemics in some unusual and bad ways, such that it will inevitably cause human migrations. And those migrations, if we don't deal with them, and deal with them from a human rights perspective rather than a military perspective, it's likely to cause a great deal of human suffering. In fact, it already is. Maybe talk about a little bit of the suffering, just hit 1 or 2 things later. But my thesis basically is that international law, which has been stuck for a long time, has many gaps, needs change up and down the line, from treaties to customary international law to refugee law to soft law. We need sort of an all hands on deck approach to the problem. So, but before I begin and get into the thesis, I just wanted to say a little bit about the word refugee. Now, my wife and I invited a Ukrainian family to live with us in the middle of June of this year. They've lived with us ever since, and are still with us. And it's a mother, a just turned 5-year-old child, and her niece is there because her parents can no longer take care of her for various reasons in Ukraine. And they've become like family to us. But you notice I use the word refugee. And some of you will immediately respond, well, that's wrong. It's formally wrong. They're not refugees. In fact, in Canada, they are considered temporary protected status. But regardless of that, thinking of them refugees, they wouldn't qualify under any possible legal definition of the term. So why do I insist on the word refugee? Well, the word refugee, as we will see, has legal problems, creates problems. And we can't go into all of the possible and all of the scholarly work on just the word and the legal bite to that word, but we'll do some of it. And the word refugee is really a kind of a legal false friend. You know, a false friend is a word in two languages that are similar words in two languages that have very different meanings. And this is kind of a legal false friend in the sense that lawyers think of the word refugee one way, and almost the rest of us, and I confess to being a recovering lawyer. I'm not only emeritus at Utah Valley University, but I'm emeritus in 2 state bars. I've given up the practice of law and gone emeritus, taken emeritus status. So I'm recovering from being a lawyer. And so I think of it in the late term more like something that would force most any of us to leave our homes for a long extended period of time. And of course, it's just not correct. That said, the question of who qualifies as a refugee is an important one and has legal, as I say, legal consequences. You have slow-moving disasters. You have like climate change, sea level rise, and so forth. You have quick onset disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, flooding, and so on. And scholars have put up a whole slew, and I don't have them all down here, of words to cover the situation, but I put a few of them in. What do we call them? Climate change refugees. There's a great contestation on that with people who don't want to broaden the term from its legal definition for fear that it will cause nations to be even worse than they already are about taking in refugees as legally defined. Do we call them migrants, survival refugees, economic migrants, forced migrants, illegal migrants? And all of these terms not only have legal bite, but they have political and social and cultural bite. And what we call them sort of in some ways directs how we think about them. And that will become an important point, as you will see, as we go through this talk. Anyway, as I said at the beginning, there are real gaps in the law, and they don't cover people that, regardless of what you think about the definition of the word refugee, people who we really think should be entitled to refuge, that is to say protection and comfort and care outside of their home country, people who have left for very real reasons that all of us, or at least I think most of us could agree, would cause us to want to leave. The 1951 Refugee Convention, as you can see, defines someone who has a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership, or political, social group, or opinion. Notice off the bat that environmental refugees or environmental migrants aren't covered. The persecution in the definition requires human agency, and although that word persecution is contested and has broadened in recent years and is much different from its World War II definition, it still doesn't cover things. It still requires some degree of human agency. It doesn't cover things like hurricanes or sea level rise, for that matter. And even the membership in a defined group, which seems simple enough, but notice that it tends to focus on the individual rather than groups of people who've left, and sort of sits kind of uncomfortably with our problem legally. So, and finally, they have to have crossed an international border, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. There was a 1967 protocol to the Refugee Convention, but it doesn't change the definition and doesn't affect the problem whatsoever. So what about other areas of the law? What about human rights law? What about international human rights law, and particularly the International Covenant of Civil and Political rights. Well, if you look at the international covenants, they mainly deal with things like non-refoulement, and they don't cover victims of environmental disaster. However, you would see that. Now, as we'll get into later, the Human Rights Committee, the UN Human Rights Committee has, in a non-legally binding opinion, opened this up a little bit. And it is part of the reason for my thesis here is that things do seem to be opening a bit, and we'll talk about that later, because that's a very important trend to move complementary protection under, or subsidiary protection under the human rights views. And it might develop, could develop in customary law and in ultimately treaties and black letter law to become more forgiving of people who leave these sorts of situations. And you might ask, well, what about environmental law? Does that do anything for survival migrants or migrants leaving their home? Well, there has been some movement there, and the conference, one of the Conference of the Parties, 21, recognized the need to respect human rights when taking action to address climate change. But the report's formulation to take into account is really aspirational, doesn't have any legal bite or teeth, and doesn't, at least up until now, give protection, legal protection one way or the other to climate migrants. And so that too leaves a gap and doesn't really address the problem. Neither regime covers internally displaced people, which are, that is, people who don't cross international borders. And really, if you look at the human migrations worldwide, the situation with regard to internally displaced people is far greater than those who actually cross borders. There are many, many, many more people who have to move from one part of a country to another, and don't trigger any of these sort of international treaties, with the exception of some guiding principles that we'll talk about, and also Africa, which has a binding treaty. So we're looking at possibly the greatest human suffering in human history. We're looking at refugees who are often indigenous or from the poorest parts of the world and least responsible for global warming. And at the same time, the wealthiest countries, and Canada's among the worst offenders, as is the US, these countries have done the most damage and are the most responsible, and have done, in many cases, the least to address the problem of the world. I do notice that the recent Conference of the Parties has now language that one hopes will start to address some of this, but that's been just in the last few days and too recent for me to address in this talk. So the potential for a health catastrophe and a migration crisis is pretty great. And let's see. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the land, the atmosphere, the ocean, the cryosphere, the biosphere, and has caused heat waves, as you've seen with the heat domes out in the West this year, heavy precipitation. I see where Buffalo just got hit with 6.5 feet of snow. I don't know what that is in metric, but it's a lot, a couple of meters. We're seeing droughts that are 1,000-year droughts in the Southwest, in places going on for year after year after year. The reservoirs in the US drying up around the world, and huge tropical cyclones. And it's affecting every region in the world. One of the points I make over and over again is that there's really nowhere to flee. Climate change. I used to live in Utah. People would say, well, sea level rise is not going to get us here, and saltwater intrusion is not going to get us here. No, but as the feral cells scratch further northward, and those dry kadiabatic winds dry out the desert Southwest, you will have water problems for sure. So we're already seeing all sorts of problems. I'm going to skip the statistical analysis, which was in my paper, just because it's a little hard to deal with in a short lecture. But the bottom line is that climate change is accelerating and is extremely unpredictable and will cause all sorts of increased violent weather and problems that and feedback loops that are essentially not something that we can right now predict or know where it's going. So the first thing that you think about when you think about the fact that there are huge flows of people around the world, and I heard on the morning news this morning where a boatload of Haitians were picked up by the U.S. Coast Guard. Their boat was floundering, and as infants, women, children, lots of vulnerable people on it. The U.S. picked them up and put most of them in detention and shipped some of them back to Haiti. So you can just see from the morning news how securitization is working. And you can see where Raytheon and Halliburton and companies like that are really planning for militarization and securitizing the border. It's really fascinating, some of the technology they've developed. There's a cactus plant that they've got, or it looks like a cactus plant, fake cactus plant, that they put out in the desert that can come on and video and give sound recordings and video recordings of anybody who passes by and what they're doing. The level of technology to supposedly secure the borders is another entire subject one could spend hours on. But the bottom line is that they're ineffective. We know that people get across. There are always ways to circumvent the strongest borders. And all you have to do is look at the way Trump tried to militarize the border in the south of the U.S. and put up a huge wall that didn't go the entire border, well, a small fraction of it, but already you're seeing tunnels under that wall, one right after the other, carrying drugs from the south to north. So they consume an increasing share of a nation's wealth. Now, the U.S. is a particularly wealthy nation, absorb a lot of that, but a lot of this does become at some point insupportable and becomes very problematic. The human suffering causes moral outrage and political and legal backlash. And I'm not just talking about the legal cases that were brought against the Trump administration, now the Biden administration in the US, and the challenges to the safe third country law here in Canada, but also all around the world. Look at what happened in Poland when they turned back thousands of Syrians and others at the Polish-Belarusian border. And so the moral outrage and political backlash and legal backlash is another cost. But really, the most important thing is that there are pragmatic, self-interested reasons to support human rights. Pandemics and climate change increase as we herd people together. It increases disease vectors as your camps herd people together, far more densely populated than even our cruise ships, and increases the mutations of viruses and that they will escape. And we know from the evidence that climate change is increasing the incidence of pandemics and the likelihood that pandemics will spread for a variety of reasons, technical reasons that I won't get into here because of time. And there's a lot of scholarship too on the racism, bigotry, misogyny that these policies promote. And they're increasingly popular in right-wing governments. Saw that with Trump. Viktor Orban, with Jair Bolsonaro and others. So anyway, there are lots of linkages, and we can't talk about them all in a short talk, but the linkages between disease and climate change and wild weather are acute. Now, the most obvious is heat. Jim Hansen is probably one of the earliest and best known climate scientists. He testified way back in the I guess it was the Johnson administration who testified before Congress and also to the president about climate change. He says that by the middle of, or by the end of the century, huge parts of the world are likely to become practically uninhabitable if we continue on the path that we're on now. Just let that sink in for a moment. 1.2 billion people. More, what's that? It's more than an eighth. We just passed the 8 billion mark. So you're talking about a gigantic number of people living in a part of the world that could possibly, predictions are always difficult. I think it was Niels Bohr who said that predictions are difficult, particularly about the future. But still, if this were to come about, it would be a human disaster larger than anything we can imagine. So it also suggests that although sea level rise is kind of the poster child, see islands tending to go under. I saw in the CBC 2 days ago where Tuvalu is planning to go and onto the metaverse and create its island in electronically on the computer. And other islands will be going under pretty quickly. Shishmaref and Newtok and other islands in Alaska, off the Alaska coast, people are moving already. Ile de Jean Charles is going under in south of Louisiana. Ironically, the Choctaw there escaped the Trail of Tears in the 1830s and were able to get outside of into a wild part of the country where they were able to subsist for all this time, and now are having to move thanks to their island going under the Gulf of Mexico. So then what is the connection between climate change and migration? Well, the honest answer is we really don't know. Sociologists and social scientists tell us that when you go out and you canvass people and do research, they tend, whether they're from Mali in Africa or out on the islands in the Maldives or wherever, and a lot of research has been done on this, they tend to say, well, they're leaving for economic reasons, they're leaving for a better job or whatever. But nonetheless, there's a strong intuition, and I think it's right, that climate change is at least a part of what is factored into things. I'll just give one or two examples. In Syria, climate change for 3-year drought devastated the farms. Farmers and their families and other people from the rural areas moved into the big cities. They were hungry, they were out of work, they were not being, they were in a desperate situation. They protested, and we know that the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad attacked them, and there were huge amounts of violence and hundreds of thousands of refugees and people dead. And now that we're talking the Ukraine war, we can think back to the barrel bombs and chlorine gassing of these people. It was just a horrible situation. Well, was it climate change? Was it poor governance? Well, we may not know the degree to which each applies, but it's pretty clear that climate change at least played a role in that problem. Similarly with Bangladesh, the Rohingya of the Rakhine state of Myanmar fled to Cox's Bazar, and they're being herded together in places where COVID-19 is likely to, and has been spreading rapidly. And obviously their chances to mutate the virus are much greater when it's spreading it in such large amounts. The population density is far greater than even a cruise ship. It's a huge population density, but also it sucks up the water in the aquifers. It invites saltwater intrusion and into some of the freshwater lenses in this low-lying area. And the hills are being denuded of forests, causing slides, mudslides, and environmental damage. And it's estimated that that part of Bangladesh will be the worst hit by climate change in all of South Asia. Just a terrible situation. And ironically, the Bangladesh government is putting people out on Basan Char, a char island that is just silting sand that builds up and washes away from time to time in the Indian Ocean. And it's not really clear that the island is habitable, but nonetheless, that's the Bangladesh government's solution to the problem. Well, then we've got all these interlocking problems between pandemics and climate change and people suffering. What can be done? Well, there are some conceptual challenges, as I think, if you followed me so far, you can see are fairly obvious. First off is causation. Do we look at the kind of cause? Do we look at persecution? Or can we come up with a way to deal with people who flee, where human agency may not be obvious, or where the causal chains are so long and so complex that you can't really ferret them out? The scholar Alexander Betts at Oxford and others say no, that causation is not a useful distinction, and that we should be focusing on survival migrants, anyone who's fleeing for survival. That's a great suggestion, but of course there are problems with it, as there are with any suggestion that one might make. How do we determine whether people are being displaced even if we open it up and change and don't require persecution? How do we tell that they're environmental causes? Certainly, you've got people fleeing corrupt governance. And at what point do we want to try to distinguish that from those who flee for environmental reasons? But even more interestingly, more importantly, you will notice that Canada and the US and Europe have often tried to say, well, people are just leaving for economic reasons. They're seeking a better life. The US has probably been one of the worst offenders for this, but it's not the only one. And it really gets a short route to the nativist and sort of racially bigoted assumption that they're all just illegals. They're all just trying to come to get a better life, and that they're all unworthy. And that racist and misogynistic and nativist view is quite, has it, may recall from the Trump administration, is quite prevalent and quite strong. And US is not the only place, obviously, where that kind of thinking. And although Trump was pretty open and obvious about his racism, other autocratic leaders and even other democracies have been more subtle, but the racism seething underneath, I think many scholars have pointed out and have written whole books upon. So how do we determine those who are legitimately fleeing disaster is a fraught one and a difficult one, particularly in the political context that we find ourselves. Nonetheless, we do sort of need to move on. One might say, well, the sinking island states, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Tarawa, the Maldives are an easy exception. You might say, well, they're going under. That's an obvious case, but it, as we'll see, is not quite so obvious. Long before these nations go under, the sea and overcome by sea level rise, the fresh water will become a problem. Many of them are sitting on a very thin freshwater lens that sits up on top. Fresh water is lighter or less dense than salt water and will tend to float on top. But as sea level rise comes up, it will tend to affect the seawater, the sea level, the fresh water, and you will have also agriculture badly affected. Salt affects the fields, subsistence agriculture. You have all kinds of problems with even figuring out when somebody from a sinking island should be allowed to leave. And if you think that nonetheless that those islands are relatively easier cases, what about Bangladesh, where there will, for the foreseeable future, be some remnant of the land where you could, or people could pack into. And Bangladesh is probably a poster child for what's a problem all around the world. You see reports every day of people dying in Morocco, trying to get into Spain, parts of Spain. The picture of the child who is washed up on the beach is, I think, seared in everybody's mind. Violence is around all of these borders, but as Harsha Walia points out, today the India-Bangladesh border has the shameful honor of being the border with the highest number of deaths at the hands of an enforcement agency. Between 2000 and 2018, as many as 1,144 Bangladeshis were killed, 1,078 injured, 1,367 abducted, 15 raped. And those numbers are probably low, because I'm sure not all of it gets reported. But there's a huge problem at the border, and conceptual problems, political problems, and violence problems. Well, what about a solution? How should the international law respond? Well, one thing you can look at, and I think this is particularly interesting to law students. I gave a lecture to law students yesterday at Osgoode, and we'll give another one later, is legal activism. Legal activism can really make a difference. In the Titiata case, which I mentioned previously, is, I think, a good case to begin with. Michael J. Kidd, who is a New Zealand lawyer, had the Titiata case, and it really shows how activism can fall short of its goal and still have a positive impact, possibly moving soft law and perhaps customary law, potentially hard black letter law forward. Ian Titiata moved with his family from Tarawa in the Kiribati island chain, and they moved to New Zealand, and New Zealand moved to deport them, and the New Zealand authorities had deported them when Kidd brought claim before the United Nations Human Rights Committee. And the evidence showed that Kiribati was losing land, was likely to no longer be a nation after maybe 10 to 15 years, at least that's the prediction that was given in the evidence before the tribunals in New Zealand. And there was lack of fresh water. There was subsistence agriculture had become nearly impossible. There was violence in the streets as people became crowded into harsher and harsher conditions on the island. There were children getting diarrhea and getting sick and not being able to get adequate medical care. The evidence that was before the courts and also before the committee was pretty compelling. Nonetheless, the committee ruled against Titiata, and they on a very reading that set up a very high evidentiary burden. But because the lawyer had innovatively framed the case as involving climate refugees, here we get to the word and the meaning of a term. What does it mean to be a climate refugee? Well, it can't come under the convention. But what it can do is it could frame it as a human rights issue coming under the protocol to the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. And what that did was allowed the committee to make some interesting things. So that while they set up a high burden, evidentiary burden, and dismissed his claim, saying that the evident risk must be personal and can't derive merely from general conditions of receiving state, except in the most extreme cases, and set up a very high threshold for providing substantial grounds to establish a real risk of irreparable harm. Even though that imminence requirement, as you can see, was very high, they said some helpful things that I think, and a lot of other scholars have looked at it, think. Let's see if I can get to the, yeah, here we go. The obligation not to extradite, deport, otherwise transfer may be broader than the scope of the principle of non-refoulement under international refugee law, since it may also require protection of aliens not entitled to refugee status. Well, that advocacy, a lot of scholars and lawyers are picking up on. It's the Human Rights Committee is non-binding, but it's highly persuasive, and it looks like it's the kind of thing that could have legs, could run ultimately when we start talking about changes in law. And I'll talk in a little bit later about how that might be. But I'll skip the dissent. Time is running on us. There are really 5 ways to change international law to better address this problem. The first one, amending either the Refugee Convention or the 1967 Protocol, seems pretty much quixotic. There are, I think, 141 nations or so that have adopted the protocol, and getting everybody together, probably a pretty scary thing, because you never know how conventions to change a treaty are going to go. It could go the wrong way. And in any event, getting agreement to amend the treaty is probably not going to happen. You could develop a new treaty or protocol, and that might possibly be something that would be in the cards, but it really would be a piecemeal sort of a thing at this point. You're not likely to get a lot of nations, and particularly the wealthier nations who have, such as Canada and the US and many of the European nations, I think would, they've worked so hard to keep refugees out, it's hard to see how they would now turn around and engage in a treaty that would deal positively with the problem. Nonetheless, it is something that one could work on. There are, as we will see, a number of regional and bilateral networks of protection to be worked piecemeal, and some of those have some real promise. And as I talked about earlier with Michael Kidd and the Titicaca case, lawyers have a great role in developing and systematizing advocacy before international bodies, courts, including the European Human Rights Court, Canadian and US courts, national courts. There's a wide area, and a lot of people are already doing this. This is not new to me. I forget the man's name, but there was a person who wrote an entire book that's in Cambridge University Press on advocacy before both the European Human Rights Court and the European Court of Justice. So, so these things are being done. But as we've seen, there's still definitional problems. There is some hope. There is at least some indication that we may be nearing a tipping point on climate change. There's been a recent body, and I saw it was in the papers this morning, as early this morning, that the Stop Ecocide or Ecocide Foundation has proposed a treaty to criminalize and put before the International Criminal Court the crime of ecocide. That's kind of an interesting proposal and seems to be gaining some steam. We'll see how that goes. But we also see that under the law, the fossil fuel companies are more and more litigation against them, which was a dead end just a few years ago, seems to be gaining steam. Shareholders in companies are now putting environmentalists on the board over the strenuous objections from the board and from management. I notice, for example, too, that the notion of personhood for the environment, what we call standing to sue, has changed. If you think about that, that wasn't even a thing until Christopher Stone wrote his article in California Law Review in 1970, Do Trees Have Standing?, which is picked up in some dissents by William O. Douglas in some environmental cases. And now we see courts all around the world, New Zealand, Mexico, Chile, picking up on this and saying that at least to some degree there's personhood for nature, for rivers or mountains, streams, and so forth. And so it does look like that we may be at a kind of tipping point. One can never know a tipping point until you've actually sort of gone over it. And so I'm not making any kind of a strong prediction here. It's more of a hope than a prediction, I would say. But we have seen changes in customary international law. For those of you who are not lawyers, customary international law is just the custom of nations and what nations almost uniformly do out of a sense of legal obligation. So you can see that to change it would ordinarily be very, very slow. Nations don't quickly move out of a sense of legal obligation in ways that can be tracked and added up and say, okay, now this is customary international law. Piracy and slavery, I guess, which are actually use Kogan's principles, but they might be an example where the nations are pretty uniform on this. However, there's been an interesting proposal by Michael Scharf that customary international law may be able to change very, very rapidly in periods of fundamental change, of rapid change. And so that you don't wait for all of the nations to get together and do something out of a sense of legal obligation. He argues that in a period of great change in world history, there can be, quote, transformative developments in which the new rules and doctrine of customary international law emerge with unusual rapidity and acceptance. He calls this a Grotian moment after the 17th century jurist Hugo Grotius. And he says that this might actually, he argues this might actually apply to climate change. And he gives a really interesting example, the Nuremberg trials, which, if you know, Control Order 10 and the basically just made it up out of whole cloth. Crimes against humanity, aggressive war, and so forth had a very thin legal basis before the Nuremberg trials. One could spend a whole lecture on what that basis was, but it was pretty thin, and it was certainly a lot of stuff that was just new in the Nuremberg trials. And the concept of genocide as a crime against humanity comes up for the first time there, and the word hadn't been invented until Raphael Lemkin invented it in 1943 and came up with his book, 1944 book, Axis Rule in Europe. So you had a new thing here. And one of the things the Nuremberg trials did was to take the notions of conspiracy, criminal, joint criminal conduct, JCE 1, 2, and 3, various flavors of criminal conduct, and imported them. Now, they were totally unknown to the civil law, and even Britain and the US, I mean, Canada did not have much experience with it. So-called Pinkerton liability was a US development in the 1920s, and hadn't really filtered out into the law until the Nuremberg trials. Well, why do I mention this? Well, Scharf argued before the extraordinary chambers of Cambodia, the joint criminal enterprise had become customary international law as of the Nuremberg trials, and the extraordinary chambers of courts of Cambodia, which were dealing with the killing fields of the 1970s, said yes, yeah, it does, and convicted on that basis. So there is some reason to think that as we reach a tipping point, if we reach a tipping point, that we might also be at a tipping point in the change in law, and that people working in advocacy in that direction might be useful. And there have been other efforts in that direction. We'll do some just very quickly, so I can end up here, but the guiding principles on internal displacement of the UN, they're non-binding legally, but they make a really good argument about compiling things from existing treaty law and hard law, and by analogy, refugee law to apply to internally displaced people. And as I pointed out earlier, the African states, they have the convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa. In South America, the Cartagena Declaration. I won't go into what all these things do because I want to wrap up here and leave time for questions. But Africa has the Kampala Convention, which also is very good. Notice these don't really affect the places where we most need it, perhaps South Asia and so forth, but they're a really good start and something that nations might choose to emulate. So to wrap up, there's really nothing that adequately affects human migration, whether from pandemics or from climate change. And there are a lot of people around the world working to try to change this and to advocate for change, to try to change this situation. And I would argue that we need to encourage those changes wherever we can, whether it's treaty law, soft law, customary law, working within one's own nation state. Here in Canada, working, for example, to end safe third country practice with the US treaty. All sorts of things we can do. I notice here at Osgoode Law School that there are all sorts of posters up talking about how lawyers, for example, can affect social change. But it's not just lawyers. Obviously, Greta Thunberg is not a lawyer. Michael Mann is not a lawyer. There are lots of people who are working very hard right now on these issues, and that's just the sum total of my papers to say that we really need to encourage this kind of advocacy wherever we see it, wherever we find it. And I'm done. Get rid of screen sharing. There we go. I will happily entertain any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you